Welcome to this latest IFPMA media briefing on COVID-19. We're going to be looking at progress being made on innovation, manufacturing and equitable access to vaccines, treatments and their supplies. My name is Claire Dool and I'm your moderator. Journalists, starting from now, that's 14:30 Central European Time and 8:30 Eastern Time, please start putting your questions in the chat box and say who you're working for. We're going to be answering those questions in the second part of the briefing after our speakers have set the scene. And we've got a truly global lineup of CEOs from some of the leading innovative biopharmaceutical companies. Let me introduce you to them. We have Dr. Paul Stoffels, Chief Scientific Officer and Vice Chairman of the Executive Committee of Johnson & Johnson. Welcome, Paul. We have Belén Garijo, who is the Chair of the Executive Board and CEO of Merck. Dr. Bourla, Chairman and CEO of Pfizer and Vice President of IFPMA, and Bill Anderson, CEO of the Pharmaceuticals division of the Roche Group. But first, let's hear from the Director General of the IFPMA, Thomas Cueni, who's going to put in context this briefing. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire. We are going to hear in a moment from Rasmus, Bech, Hansen about manufacturing scale-up and where we are with vaccine manufacturing. Their vaccine production data from Airfinity have been over the last 9 months spot on, and their forecasts have been extremely correct. In a fast-moving pandemic, this forecast, I think, is really important for evidence-based policymaking. The Airfinity data will demonstrate that the momentum of COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing scale-up over the past 9 months is now sufficient for step change in equitable distribution of vaccines and hopefully sufficient to turn the tide. This month, COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing output will pass the 7.5 billion dose mark and reach 12 billion doses by the end of this year. This is literally from zero at the beginning of this year. To put it in perspective, let's bear in mind that pre-COVID-19 global vaccine manufacturing capacity for all vaccines, including seasonal flu vaccine, was between 3 and 5 billion. The amazing scale-up would not have been possible without the achievement of scientists, medical teams, and people actually who participated in clinical trials. But we should also call out the engineers, the scientists, and those in producing the equipment and materials to manufacture the vaccine. By June 2022, we expect that we will have more than 24 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines available, and production is on course. At this point, vaccine supplies may actually outstrip global demand. Vaccine manufacturers are now producing 1.5 billion doses per month and are expected to continue manufacturing at that scale. On the basis of the most conservative projections, governments in G7 countries alone, even if they reach vaccination rates of the adult population, which means 12 plus, and use booster shots for vulnerable people, are expected to have at least 1.2 billion doses available for redistribution for those in need. I've asked colleagues involved in manufacturing whether they believe that the figures from Airfinity are plausible, and they say they are. They are confident that companies will be able to deliver. But it also means that the government still holding back doses, stocks in case of shortages, no longer need to do so. Now, the news should be a game changer for vaccine equity. We cannot be insensitive to the fact that so far only about 6% of Africa's adult population have received full vaccination, whereas in many of the Western countries, we are at 70% plus. Now, if these 1.2 billion doses are shared before the end of this year, it would mark a turning point in vaccine distribution and open the way to reset for vaccine equity. Now, this is something the groups, the innovative industry which I represent, have been calling for since May this year. Then we publicly committed to do all we could to make additional uncommitted COVID-19 doses available to low and lower middle income countries. We also committed to work with governments who have stocks of COVID-19 vaccines to share, to arrange for vaccines to be redistributed to COVAX or other established mechanisms. And we have seen exactly this happening with the announcements at the G7 meeting with G20 meetings. G7 and G20 leaders are making strides to improve dose sharing, and we welcome the increasing focus from these leaders to respond to the challenge of greater dose sharing. Now, going forwards, leadership and coordinated action will help ensure the step change in distribution, but also in country readiness, as removing delivery and administration bottlenecks in the countries where the vaccines are badly needed will be key. Especially mRNA vaccines might make up to 40% of the additional doses available, and here again, the vaccine manufacturers stand by their commitments of May 21 to support country readiness and work with countries, governments, and international agencies. Now, even in the face of the Delta variant, current authorized vaccines show continued strong protection from infection and excellent effectiveness against hospitalization and deaths. Still, for those people who do contract COVID-19 or cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons, treatments will remain an important and integral part of COVID-19 mitigation strategies. Now, thankfully, a handful of authorized COVID-19 treatments are becoming standard of care for COVID-19 patients that have been hospitalized and are saving lives. I mentioned just two. Monoclonal antibody treatments are beginning to offer promise, as are novel antivirals. The biopharmaceutical industry involved in the development and treatment and its suppliers are working on scaling up manufacturing capacity of treatments too, but the effective rollout to COVID-19 patients is also dependent on access and demand planning. Getting the therapeutic rollout right will be important for all countries to be able to benefit from future innovation, such as the anticipated oral outpatient COVID-19 therapeutic candidates. Now, let us hope we will soon witness a turning point when we see leaders united in giving equitable vaccine distribution a shot in the arm. Now, over to Rasmus Bech Hansen, the CEO and founder of Airfinity, which is an independent organization that provides data to governments, NGOs, international agencies, and the private sector. Over to you, Rasmus.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you for that very kind introduction and also for setting the scene in such a clear and data-driven way. Just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen. That works. Then I will quickly run through some key updates on where we are on COVID-19 around the world, and also very much look into the future and what we expect going forward. I think it's fair to say that it's been a somewhat of a bumpy year, and it's far from over yet. It's looking at the global situation, it's a bit of a mixed bag. We're actually seeing cases globally rising many places. We're seeing, if you look at the bottom left corner, we are seeing cases not far from the peak earlier in the year. We are sadly also seeing death and mortality still at very high levels. A lot of that is driven by the spread of the Delta variant, the highly infectious variant that came out this year, and you can see the green colors in where that is the dominating strain. But we're also seeing a number of other variants still being important, and most recently we've heard of a new Mu variant that there's some concerns about, and that's definitely not the last thing we're going to hear about different variants. But I think that the silver lining and the really positive news here is that if you look at the slide to the bottom right, you can see that the fully vaccinated people around the world, it is actually extraordinary. We have almost 30% of the global population fully vaccinated. And that's also why you see the link between the two curves, the cases globally and the deaths globally, are not following each other. Vaccines seems to have broken that link. So although we might continue to see spikes in infections, spikes in cases, we are unlikely to see the similar increase in mortality, increase in hospitalizations. And that's really critical for decision makers around the world. Thomas kindly was kind to praise some of these forecasts, and I just we are constantly bringing out new forecasts, especially around the production, because given the importance of vaccines in fighting this virus, availability of vaccines is of course critical, and so far there has been issues with accurately being able to forecast when can we get certain deliverables of vaccines. So we've developed this model that so far has turned out to be fairly robust, and we're also quite confident in the numbers we see going forward. Thomas touched on some of these numbers. We have in August more than 6 billion doses, and we expect 12 billion doses to be produced by the end of the year. By all accounts, an absolutely extraordinary number. I should say that a lot of these are from China, so Chinese vaccines, and I think that has been a surprise to pretty much everyone, how fast China has scaled up vaccine production. China didn't used to be a major vaccine exporter, and now kind of emerged as a real leader in that. There are some question marks around efficacy, etc., but they are important part of those 12 billion numbers, and have produced. So it's kind of half Chinese and half Western, more or less. And the leading most produced Western vaccine candidates are Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, and Oxford AstraZeneca. I should also say that we track the contracts and collaborations across the industry, and I think it's actually been really incredible to see how much collaboration there's been. We've tracked more than 231 collaborations or agreements on production. It's fair to say that we wouldn't have seen this production scale up if industry hadn't stepped up and really kind of opened up to each other and collaborated at unprecedented level. However, I think it is also important to make this fully evidence-based, to say that when you look at where all these vaccines come from, we expect that 73% of those come from in-house production facilities. So we can definitely see there's large economies of scale in producing and in fully controlling the value chain. And it seems companies that have pursued that strategy are able to produce at somehow higher rate. And I think that's an important also point to bear in policy discussions. When we then look at the important issue of, we have all these vaccines coming in the coming months, we can see that countries have vaccinated at high level, Western countries have vaccinated at high level. How many doses will then be available for redistribution? And redistribution, by that we mean vaccines that a country has already purchased, I expect to see coming into the country, but that they might not be able to use. Some of that depends on the booster campaigns. The evidence out there is still somewhat inconclusive. We're also seeing countries around the world choosing different booster policies. Of course, there's a lot of debate around that. But even assuming a very conservative booster strategy, by that I mean a booster strategy where a boost will start after 6 months of the second vaccination, and also where real-world uptake of vaccines will continue to drive up toward 80% of the population, which is unlikely for most places. Even under that scenario, countries will have significant number of vaccines available in the coming months, and I think that is a really important message. And we've done here. Sorry, this is a little bit of a complicated slide, but I think it's an important one, because what this shows is that month on month we try to model taking the booster campaigns and saying countries will very likely have a number of vaccines set aside for booster shots. If you discount that from the stock that they will be able to have, what's then the the number left. And we estimate by the end of September, there will be around 500 million doses available from the US, UK, European Union, and Canada that could be redistributed. We haven't looked into what is the right distribution mechanism. This could be either, of course, in the form of donations or in forms of swaps or in forms of reselling. There are many ways to do that. And that I don't think one could do a data-driven approach to this, but I think that's also very much ultimately a political decision. But I will say that in the last G7 summit, 1 billion doses was pledged, and it actually seems that these stocks will be available by the end of the year, so G7 countries could meet those pledges. Yeah, so I think those are really important points, and we can provide journalists with more detailed view per country on available doses. The majority of these are mRNA vaccines, so there are some considerations also on the cold chain requirements in countries where they go to. Then just briefly on the efficacy of the vaccines, and I think it is also extraordinary to see the high efficacy numbers we're still seeing. And I know there are lots of numbers floating around. You know, there's many studies out there, and one study show one thing, another. So many people around the world are quite confused. So I just want to point out two important things. First of all, that when you look at the vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization and severe disease and death, it is still very, very high. It's still in the plus 90% against the Delta variant, and most of the variants seem to fare really well against all the variants. When you look at against protections against infections, it is somewhat lower, and it has been reduced by the Delta. And this, I should say, is a meta study, so it's combining all available studies out there into one consolidated view. We are seeing some reductions, which is, of course, also helps explain why we're seeing these increased case numbers. But if vaccines can protect against hospitalizations and death, they are playing a really, really important role, and I think that's one to bear in mind also when as hesitancy is also an issue, and good arguments for taking the vaccines are really important. So just last point is then, as Thomas also pointed out, the hidden hero in all of this. There's a lot of talk about vaccines, and in some ways also, I guess, the easier issue to cover. But the hidden hero in all of this are the treatments. So we've seen kind of a really remarkable scale up and a lot of treatments coming to market. Last year in September, there was 1 approved treatment. We now have 8 approved treatments around the world, and they have saved, also by our estimates, millions of lives. We are very excited about the prospect of some of the antivirals and monoclonal antibodies coming to market, and some of them could be true game changers in fighting the virus. And I think as we move into an endemic state of COVID-19, where we will not kind of see a full eradication of it, that's very unlikely, then treatments will continue to play a really important role. And I think it's very positive for the world that that there's so much scientific activity and so much progress being made in these areas. So with that, I'll conclude and say thank you, Thomas, and Owen, back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Rasmus, for that COVID-19 data snapshot. And just to say to the journalists that you can find the slide deck on the Airfinity website and also on the IFPMA website. So let's start with some scene setting from our speakers. Albert, if I can start with you, I think that you said that you expected to produce around 1.3 billion doses by the end of 2021, but actually it's going to be nearer 3 billion doses. So can you explain how you have achieved that in such short time? And also, of course, can you increase even further?
Yes, just to give you magnitude of the size, Pfizer was producing a peak 200 million doses per year of vaccines in general before the pandemic, for all our vaccines. Our initial estimation that we gave was 500-600 million doses, and we went to 1.3 billion doses just about the turn of the year. And we increased that, and we are very confident right now that we're going to make 3 billion doses. So it's a substantial increase. We already made in the first half the 1 billion. So in the second 6 months, we are doubling this production. How we were able to achieve that, a lot of things. First of all, I think sleepless nights and a lot of effort of thousands of people at Pfizer, that they are doing everything they can to make sure that everything works smoothly, and they give themselves to it. They do that because they take significant pride of what they do, of their work, and how that affects the lives of many. Now, unfortunately, goodwill and passion is not enough to accomplish such a monumental work. So there were, first of all, billions of investments that they started very early at risk. So we had built the infrastructure to be able to do that way back. Already we started at risk. So, for example, by June, we had already built the infrastructure to make much more. The only bottleneck was our raw materials. And in order to secure that more and more raw materials will be available, we literally created new suppliers. So not only we went and helped those suppliers that were making their raw materials to be able to scale up their production, and when I say help, I mean both financial support, but also scientific and technical support to be able to do it fast. But also we taught new people how to do it, and by the way, we started producing a lot of this technical material. The second thing it is, Pfizer, we do that 172 years now. That's when we were founded, and we were founded by scaling up chemicals and manufacturing of medicines. So there is significant expertise in doing that. And we've chosen a path which was to focus our manufacturing production in-house for the better part of the year, because that was maximizing our ability to convert raw materials into doses. And as raw materials started becoming more available, then this is when we started expanding our manufacturing network to partners, so that we could be able to significantly increase the capacity. Right now, we expect 4 billion doses next year, very comfortably, and in 2022 full year. But of course, given everything that is happening, we will look to see if there is an opportunity to increase even further.
Understood. And as we heard from Rasmus there's a lot of discussion and sometimes action in Western countries about booster doses, vaccinating younger populations. But how are you going to get some of these doses to the countries where they've received perhaps not any or very few?
We have allocated doses already for this year. And frankly, we have allocated most or a very big part of the doses that we are going to be producing next year also. And we have allocated to countries that they have placed orders for these doses. Among this allocation, so we are changing the allocation because of the need of boosters. Those countries that had placed orders and were promised to receive some doses this year, they will receive those doses this year. We are not going to move them around because some countries have maybe bigger or different needs. Among those doses for this year, the 3 billion, for example, that we said that we will manufacture this year, we have allocated 41% to middle and low-income countries. This will not change. Middle and low-income countries will receive their 40%. And we have allocated at least 1 billion, although we do not have orders for 1 billion for low and middle-income countries, for next year. Again, I think it's important, those that they would like to receive doses, that they secure their order. All the orders, again, most of them for next year, have gone to high-income countries. And I'm afraid that we will have the same again. When the available doses will be allocated to those that are placing orders, and those that they do not place orders, then they will feel that they are not getting, although they should have acted. So doses exist. And this year, we have allocated, and we will give more than $1 billion, 41% of the 3, as I said, to low and middle income countries.
Albert, what sort of challenges are there in manufacturing and distributing so many doses, but also this very important question of equitable distribution? And what challenges are you facing at the moment, and what ones do you think that you might be facing during the rest of the year and next year?
I think our biggest challenge is to be able to manufacture more were around raw materials. Now, there were other type of challenges, technical challenges that could appear here and there, but our scientists were able to resolve on the way. So this is the net results are the 3 billion doses. Clearly, there were challenges with export restrictions that were, let's say, prohibiting us from allocating more rationally doses. So there would be times that there would be surplus in a place and demand in another that could not be resolved because you couldn't move the surplus outside the country. There were some issues with raw materials that also, not the availability of raw material, but were affected by the trade, let's say, restrictions that were happening. Mainly these were the challenges that we were facing from our side to create volume. For equitable distribution, there are two things that needs to be in place. One, a price that everyone can afford to pay, depending on his power, financial, economic power. And then the second, availability of doses for all. I spoke about availability for doses for all because that was the main issue. When it comes to ability to pay, that was resolved already, I think, back. We implemented a tiered pricing. So countries with high income, they were receiving one tier of pricing, mainly the cost of a meal in this country for those. But the mid-income countries received half of this price. And the low-income countries, from our side, and the low-income countries received at cost. And as far as I know, most of the companies are giving at cost to the low-income countries, and many are giving at cost to others as well. So the cost was not an issue, and availability was the biggest challenge. When, as you can see, we almost made miracles here.
Albert, thank you very much for that update. Let me move on to Paul from Johnson & Johnson, who perhaps can fill us in on some of the challenges that Johnson & Johnson have had to overcome in terms of manufacturing and distribution in the past 18 months.
Well, thank you, Claire, for having me at the forum here. We began scale-up of manufacturing parallel with R&D in early 2020. We have taken multiple steps to COVID-19 vaccine in order to provide the global access. Producing adenovectors needs special equipment, which was not readily available. So we had to establish new production equipment in all of our production plants in a record time. And we are making rapid progress now to completing a global manufacturing network for our vaccine across 4 continents with 11 manufacturing sites. And as Albert was saying, it is taking thousands of people at J&J, but also in partner companies, and it's a very significant investment.
So,
at the beginning, we developed a platform over the last 10 years. Yeah, sorry?
No, sorry, we had a little bit of a line problem. That's why I interrupted you. Please carry on, Paul.
Okay, we developed a vaccine platform from the beginning to combat pandemics such as Ebola and Zika. And so it's a single dose. We started development work to no refrigeration requirements. It's uniquely positioned for low and middle income countries and low healthcare resource settings. So as we set up our manufacturing and supply chain, we have made a commitment immediately also to the equitable access and committed by putting 1 billion doses forward available to the low and middle income countries in the next 12 to 18 months. Yeah. Our strategy on focusing technology transfer brought us to partnering with Aspen Pharmacare in South Africa. Aspen is now fully in production, and we anticipate that all the supplies produced in Aspen from now on will go to COVAX countries and the African Union. We are also transferring our technology as we speak to BioE in India. Drug substance production, so the active vaccine material, is currently being validated and fill and finish operation has started. And by the end of this year, we estimate that significantly more than 50% of the J&J vaccine will be delivered to low and middle income countries. We continue to face a number of challenges. Tech transfers are highly technical by nature and highly complex. We need to work with many partners. Multiple steps are needed there: biological manufacturing, quality testing and release, regulatory inspections and control. And so we need to work with multiple countries around the world to get this done. But now we're trying to do that in a record time, months versus years, and we try to overcome all those challenges. Most critical is training of workforce in new technology and sterility. Never before, I think, more people worked in the vaccine environment than today, and talent is very critical. Already brought up significant threat to export controls or restrictions in countries where products produce of drug substance and fill and finish, but also very important consumables. And there is a lot of the consumable market is under enormous stress, both in the biological production for routine cancer and other drugs, as well as now in the vaccine market. And we are doing exceptional work with suppliers to make sure that that's not putting a restriction on the capacity of supplies. So lots of collaboration, Claire, with governments, other partners, contractors, but also suppliers to make sure the supply chain continues to function.
It would be interesting to find out a bit more about that cooperation, because I think you've said that in the race between variants and vaccines, we're lagging behind. So in order to turn vaccines into vaccinations, what do you think the global public health community needs to do around the world?
Well, Claire, there's a massive amount of work which is between vaccines and vaccine implementation. We need to execute global legal agreements with governments, with healthcare systems. We have the no full compensation coverage for vaccine recipients in each of the countries, streamlining regulatory processes around the world to approve not just the vaccine, but also the products, the vaccines itself, and the manufacturing plants which we deploy. Technology transfers with production partners, pharmacovigilance systems measuring and reporting safety of the vaccines, very critical to inform the recipients on risks, but at the same time keep that the vaccines are very well developed and safe. And then the coordination with global partners is really a challenge. And to ensure that we get the race on with the mutants is that the world needs to be vaccinated as soon as possible. And that's where surplus vaccines need to end up in all of the different countries with less vaccines, and therefore stockpiling of vaccines should not happen. They should be used immediately. And we have to make sure vaccination is at very high levels in every country.
Yeah, a very clear call there for dose sharing. Paul, just a very quick question about your reading of the situation of the impact of these variants. Rasmus was mentioning some of those in his presentation on the effectiveness of the current vaccines. Mm-hmm.
First, it is amazing what we have seen in the last year from the first strain to the different strains we worked before they were called to the countries, but now we have the number, the letters, the delta to the different strains, and it's Darwin at work. Yeah, the more the virus can grow and transmit, the more it can mutate. And the fitter variants will take over, and the Delta variants are taken over in 3-4 months, the whole world, and that's where the fittest survive. And we are actually lucky that the current vaccines still work on all the variants. And
I'm afraid
future mutations could arise where we need different vaccines. Yeah? And that's where it's so important that vaccination happens quickly so that we limit the replication and therefore limit the arrival of new mutants in the world. And we have demonstrated ourselves that with our studies that the current Delta variant is very well covered with our vaccine as well with others. But closely monitoring variants is going to be very critical and if necessary, I think the industry stands ready to do the necessary scientific work to generate new variant vaccines, if that would be needed.
Paul, thank you very much for your remarks there. Let me move to Belén Garijo, the CEO of Merck, of course, a company that's well known for making drugs, but you also provide supplies and equipment across the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm just wondering about your challenges in scaling up supplies for vaccines.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Claire, for the question, and thank you for having me. So first of all, I want to emphasize what Albert already mentioned, that from day one, our teams were guided by a single mission, and that was to contribute to the global efforts against the COVID-19 pandemic. And like many others here on the panel and the entire pharmaceutical and life science industry, and we at Merck has been supporting more than 80 vaccine projects with manufacturing inputs such as cell culture media, bioreactors, and lipids for the mRNA vaccines. I think, speaking of the challenge to further scale the supply of vaccines, I would like to mention several aspects. First of all, as you already know, the pandemic brought unprecedented demand for all suppliers of life science, raw materials, equipment, and consumables. And our life science business delivers several products that are crucial to manufacturing vaccines, like single-use bioreactors, filtration devices. And we have been trying to deliver very, very fast on the unimaginable, starting by making the maximum out of the existing capacity, because that was going to give us tons of speed, while in parallel expanding capacity as fast as we can. And we have significantly invested on capacity expansion with several projects that we have announced amounting to more than 200 million euro capex to address the demand for crucial products and to serve all the vaccines manufacturers. So we are absolutely focused on realizing these projects, recruiting and training thousands of new colleagues, and that has been a revolution for the organization. Now, taking a longer view, we must agree that a global crisis really asks for a global response and global access to vaccines, also several times mentioned here. And from that perspective, we also support the development of the local biotech industry, but we also know that this is not going to be a short-term fix. So this is more of a long-term strategy on pandemic preparedness, but we need to keep it in the back of the mind and do not lose sight of the longer term. And trade has been very briefly mentioned, but this has been also important, and in a way, it became a challenge that we have also fixed with our capacity expansion, establishing future regional sites in case these trade restrictions may stay for the longer term. So tariffs, sometimes in several markets, biomanufacturing inputs are subject to tariffs as high as 30%, and this creates unnecessary cost for producers and influences the sustainability of operations. So I think we have to make some efforts to really challenge each and every existing barrier that we have identified during this time. In summary, expanding capacity at the speed of light and making the maximum out of our own sites everywhere has been really concentrating our efforts. And this is not a simple task, right? Because only hiring thousands of people to staff and training them to do something which is so specific and so requires so much expertise, have been the short-term challenges, but we cannot lose, once again, perspective of what do we need to do in the longer term, and trade and making sure that we can operate flawlessly is very, very important to keep in mind for the future.
And of course, a lot of the focus has been on COVID-19, but there are implications, of course, of COVID for non-COVID-19 patients. And I'm just wondering there about what sort of challenges have there been for the treatment of other diseases, not COVID related?
That is a super important question, because COVID has indeed challenged the timely diagnosis and the treatment, the timely treatment of other diseases, both acute and chronic. So here I would like to make 3 points. One, patients need to receive care without any disruptions. Second, there were at the time open questions about the effectiveness of vaccine in some patients' populations. So we have been researching, okay, how do we deal with this? And I will give some examples. And last but not least, pharmaceutical manufacturers and their suppliers, and we are at Merck, we are in a unique position of being both, have had to manage the scale-up of vaccine production without, keep that in mind, without endangering the availability of other medicines and vaccines. So on the first point, I believe the greatest challenges occurred at the very beginning, because first of all, COVID occupied a very significant percentage of the healthcare resources in many countries. Then, the lockdowns didn't facilitate, the access to hospital. Patients were fearful, many people with chest pain didn't dare to go to a hospital not to get infected. And in some areas, perhaps less critical, such as the fertility clinics, the treatment centers were absolutely closed for many months. Then on the second point, we know that patients with some chronic diseases, such as autoimmune diseases, are at high risk for a severe COVID-19 illness. And we have seen as well that in some studies, reduced vaccine effectiveness has been observed in immunocompromised patients, such as cancer patients. So in our case, we have been doing a lot of work to identify how we could help patients with multiple sclerosis to go through an almost normal immune response when taking a vaccine, and actually deliver interesting finding that one of our key products is actually facilitating the combination or the use of vaccines, generating an almost normal response. So we will continue to invest on really understanding what I call the collateral damage of COVID-19, and certainly this is one of the most critical areas that we need to continue to address in the future.
Belén, thank you very much for those remarks. Let me now turn to Bill Anderson from Roche. I think Rasmus said that treatments were the hidden heroes. But I'm wondering, Bill, over the past 18 months or so for Roche, what has business been like for you, obviously involved in treatments and testing in the fight against COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Claire, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. It's been really quite a marathon. Since the very early days of the pandemic, we received reports out of Wuhan of some of our medicines being used to treat the patients who were ill and hospitalized. We've eventually begun studies with 10 medicines. Some of those were experimental medicines, others were medicines that were already approved for other indications. We had some early results that were promising. Then we had results that were not so good. We discontinued some of the medicine studies. But these really highlighted some challenges, like, for example, which endpoints should we be looking at? There was an ordinal scale that was required at first, but it turned out in the end, we really had to focus on preventing progression to mechanical ventilation and preventing death. Those are really the key things to look at. But that required some experimentation to figure out which endpoints and also which patients would benefit from which medicines. One I would mention, we focused on one of our medicines called Actemra, also called tocilizumab, the USAN name. And on that one, because it's suppressing the immune system, we thought, well, you don't want to give it to patients that are newly diagnosed. It's really for patients who've progressed to a severe illness where their immune system may actually be doing more damage than good. And so we had to run multiple studies. I think ultimately we've run 7 pivotal studies, and really the definitive ones only reading out in Q1 of this year. And so I just want to give folks a sense of how challenging it's been to find this. In fact, the first pivotal study we did with Actemra, it read out negative. And so, many people thought, well, that's the answer. But we had seen enough to think, I don't think that's the complete story. We might have had some of the wrong patients being treated, the endpoints we needed to look at differently. And so ultimately we've shown that Actemra does decrease need for mechanical ventilation and death quite significantly in hospitalized patients. So, but even before we knew these things, last summer already, we knew that we would have trouble with manufacturing as much as could be required. The reason for that is with monoclonal antibodies, there are only so many facilities in the world capable of producing these. And whereas the vaccines are measured in sort of milligrams, monoclonal antibody doses are measured in grams. And so it's 1,000-fold greater. And so even while we were unsure whether we would have any benefits, we already dedicated our largest facility. It's actually, I think it's the largest biologics production facility in the world. We dedicated fully to producing medicines for COVID, both Actemra, and then also we thought that these antibodies that are directly acting against the coronavirus, that those might be important as well. And we looked around to see who is advanced in that, and we ultimately did a partnership with Regeneron, which is a company that we compete with in many other fields, but we felt like they were farthest along. This is really all about how do we help the world, and so we and they came very quickly to an agreement where we could put our capacity to use producing their medicine. So that's sort of been gives you a flavor of the last 18 months.
Certainly. And you mentioned 2 of your treatments there, Actemra and Regencov. So what else is in the pipeline?
Yeah. Well, so we're also working on a small molecule. So Roche is the company that brought the world Tamiflu, which most people are familiar with, which is a pill that reduces the duration and severity of symptoms with the flu. We followed on with another medicine called Xofluza that's more potent than Tamiflu, and that's available for flu. Well, we need something like that for coronavirus, and that doesn't exist today. There are several companies working on these pills. Actually, I think Albert and Pfizer are one of the companies working on them. And so we've got a product in the clinic of medicine that it would be a pill for coronavirus. The advantages of that, I guess it's obvious that a pill has advantages over something that has to be infused, but also hopefully we could scale them up and produce a lot more pills than these proteins that require these specialized facilities.
Bill, thank you very much, and thank you to all of our CEOs for setting the scene. I'm now going to direct some of the journalist questions that have been coming in thick and fast, so thank you very much, journalists. The first question I have, it's for Albert and then for Paul. It's from the Financial Times in the UK. Should policymakers feel confident in delaying booster shots for younger people to prioritise the developing world, knowing that they will have access to doses next year if they do need to boost everyone? Albert, I'll go to you on that one and then go to Paul.
Yeah, look, first of all, it is not my role to say who should be receiving doses. I think are the health authorities of every country that they need to make their decision based on the issues that they are facing in the country, and the issues are multiple. It's not only the percentage of people that are getting infected, but it is what other measures there are in the country. They're wearing masks, they're not wearing masks, etc. What I can say clearly, it is that younger ages are getting sick. And also what I can say clearly, it is that younger ages, when they get sick, they can get also severe sickness. It is clearly the percentage of people that will get severe in older ages is higher than in the younger, but this is not zero or very small. It is significant, the sickness that can create in the younger kids. The other thing that also we need to understand it is that kids means schools. And because of that, the kids, they have much higher probability to get infected as they socialize in high proximity with other kids. And that affects also, of course, the education, the educators, the people. And then the last thing that I can say it is that we know that the vaccines work very well in young kids. In our vaccine, we have been already through 12 years old, but it works very well. And we are working also to submit data from 5 to 11 this month. So these are the scientific facts that we all need to understand. I clearly also understand that this brings some moral questions about global distribution, but this is something that you cannot answer by not stating the facts. And the last but not least, I would say that from in our case, we will not move doses based on now I want to do kids or now I want to do boosters. The doses have been allocated for this year, and we will maintain this allocation. And this allocation had happened based on the orders that they placed when we were, let's say, opening to receive orders so that we can allocate this quantity. So that will not change the fact.
Thank you very much, Albert. Paul, your take on that question of booster shots.
It's clear the responsibility of health authorities in the world, in each of the countries, to do that. And it's about protection for severe disease and death versus protection for symptomatic disease and transmission. And it's clear that the vaccines work very well. And in our case, we have shown good sustainability now up to 8 months. We, of course, continue to evaluate that. And we also know that elderly and high-risk population are the first one to get severely sick and get hospitalized. So giving priorities to elderly and high-risk people around the world to get vaccines, I think should be considered by health authorities in the world, and then evaluate how boosters can be implemented, first based on scientific data, whether it's needed yes or no, but also on priorities. And we will work with authorities in the world to maximize protection for people, whether it's young or old, high risk or lower risk people.
Paul, there's a follow-on question from AFP here, whereas with the vaccine's production projection, do you consider that no temporary lift of patents on vaccines would be necessary for an equal access for low-income countries?
Well, I'm convinced that at the moment, patent will not help even on doing anything in the world. At the moment, it's all about optimizing existing manufacturing capacity and vaccines by those people who know how to produce. If it takes us 18 months to get to upscaling manufacturing in existing plants with existing know-how, existing people and validated systems, it will take different companies so much longer, and therefore it doesn't help. So if you let the current our industry now work hard and do what they need to do, like Bourla was indicating, what Albert was indicating, I think there will be sufficient vaccines to vaccinate, and let us focus on that.
Paul, there's another question from the continent in South Africa. European countries are returning J&J vaccines produced in South Africa to the country after concerns were raised about equity. How will Johnson & Johnson be assuring equity in distribution going forward, including orders?
Well, from today onwards, all vaccines produced on African ground will stay in Africa. And that's everything which is produced by Aspen, and we'll continue to support Aspen for expansion of their capacity and even do more. BioE is building up a huge capacity for, in addition to that, outside of the US and Europe, and we have our own capacity in the US and Europe. So going forward, I'd say let's 3-4 months from now, I don't think there will be too much of a capacity constraint in the world to supply to all people who demand, as it was demonstrated earlier by the presentation of the data. We don't see that, but equity is at the forefront, and we try to upscale as rapidly as possible to make sure that we can supply the whole world.
Bill, there's two similar questions that are coming in from Scrip here. So I will read them out, and if you need a reminder, come back to me. It says, Roche has pledged to maximize access to Actemira in middle low-income countries, including not asserting patent rights. Will Roche also commit to active tech transfer with companies in these regions? How many doses are needed for COVID patients worldwide? And DevEx is saying, is Roche looking at planning on tech transfers and data sharing to widen access to Actemira? Roche warned of a global shortage of the drug in mid-August.
Yeah, let me try to answer that, and if I missed a part of it, you can check on that. So first off, let me just say that since the beginning, we have not we have not made decisions about allocation of Actemra based on things other than the need, because we're committed to global access. We're a very global company. I think when we last did the update on this, I think at the end of Q2, from the beginning of the pandemic till the beginning of July of this year, we had delivered over 60% of the pandemic doses of Actemra were to low and middle income countries. And the supply shortage we have is a global supply shortage because, frankly, because the Delta variant and the increase in serious illness that has happened in Q2 and Q3 that, frankly, I don't think was expected. But again, as we always knew there would be limitations. We made an exceptional decision that we would not assert patent rights. If companies could make a product, a biosimilar to Actemra and deliver it and to low and middle income countries, and that in fact it looks to be happening, and we've had that posture. The reason I say it was exceptional, Paul just mentioned how IP is not impeding the rollout of vaccines around the world. It's actually, the rate limiting steps are the ability to optimize the production in the plants by the patent holders. In our case, we have all our plants at 100% capacity. We took on additional contracts at risk way back last summer. So when we didn't know whether we had medicines that would be effective, but we paid for capacity so that we could maximize our production capacity. But despite all that, there's not enough. The last thing, there was a question about whether we would support active tech transfer.
Absolutely, and data sharing.
Yeah, and I think we will do that, and we will engage in data sharing. But because tech transfer is very laborious, and we can't afford to take our people that are producing Actemra and that are also doing tech transfer to the existing external contracts we have, we can't afford to do that unless we have somebody on the outside who's got large quantities they can produce. Because again, there are only so many plants that are large capacity antibody plants. And so we would consider that as a criteria, because we just can't afford, again, for the sake of the world, we can't afford to take the resources that are making the product today off of that to go and say, start production in a very small plant that just can't make much.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that answer. Thomas, and then perhaps Albert or Paul, if you want to come in. There's two questions from Le Monde here. Is WH's goal to have at least 10% people vaccinated in each country by the end of September reachable in terms of production and deliveries, even with countries starting giving boosters? I'll just give you the one question to start with. So the WHO has set this goal of at least 10% people vaccinated.
I think basically, and of course I'm interested what Paul and what Albert see it there, but when we see, we are still talking about 2% of people vaccinated in Africa, whereas actually when you look at the world in data, it's already 6% of adult Africans fully vaccinated. Therefore, we are not that far from the 10%. When we look at the global manufacturing capacity, what we see is we moved, as we knew, trebling, as Albert said, from a 200 million capacity in Pfizer to 3 billion just for COVID-19 this year. I think that's an amazing and daunting task. We moved from serious shortages and allocation problem to soon enough vaccines to probably sometime next year an oversupply of vaccines. And I believe that we will be able, if there's political will, political leadership, to reach full vaccine equity, most likely by mid next year. I think one needs to be cautious about, too short-term targets, but when you compare that with some people who said it won't happen before 24 or even later, I think it is quite amazing how far we came. And what I see is the companies are working with the agencies like UNICEF, Gavi, the COVAX and WHO, governments like the US and others to make it happen.
So feasible if there's the political will, Thomas, is what I've understood. Albert, would you like to say what your thoughts are on the WHO's target?
From everything I know, I think it's feasible. Looking, for example, at Pfizer, as I said, we are going to give this year, right? Not this year. As I said, let's say 40+% of our total production. That's into low and middle income countries. That's, let's say, more than $1 billion. But if we focus specifically for Africa, for example, most of the AMC 92 countries, which are the countries, the poorest countries of the world, are in Africa. A lot of them, or the most populated of them. And only us have given 200 million doses to the US this year to donate, not to give in at cost. Those will go mainly to Africa, I think. So only with those doses, only from us, the donated part from the US government going to the AMC 92, we will cover this goal, which is, let's say, 20% if we go, let's say 15%, 18% if we give $200 million. So I think, yes, we will recover. And also I think next year we should be having enough doses for all that they want to receive. Then we will reach the same problems that we are reaching at the high-income countries with people that they are refusing to get vaccination. But as far as I know, that will be even higher. So, for example, the percentage of hesitancy in those countries will be way, way higher than the percentage of hesitancy in Europe or in the US or in Japan, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that will be the issue of getting those people vaccinated and not the availability as we move to next year.
Okay. Paul, very, very quickly, are you a yes as Thomas?
Let me add to that. What's going to be important, in addition to what Albert was saying, is that setting up the way countries can donate to the lower income countries. And with COVAX, we have set up a whole facility where countries in the West can donate via COVAX, and UNICEF will implement, and that will go very fast. And we have seen that now different countries, US, Europe, but also several European countries, Canada, they're all thinking about how can we donate the surplus in a very effective way to the low and middle income countries. And that will help and assist very, very quickly on top of the direct supplies from us to the countries, while that's hand to mouth. Every vaccine which is distributed is used immediately. The West have now a surplus, and that can be donated to assist in meeting that goal before the year end, or the higher percentage before the year end. And even in September, it will help.
Thank you. Belén, a question here from Le Monde, which says, can you tell us more about the export restrictions and bottlenecks you're facing? Can you give some examples?
Well, I gave the example of tariffs, for example, and the burden that this is bringing to the manufacturers. But I think, we have all been confronted with the consequences of the Defense Production Act in the U.S. So making sure that we take this as an opportunity to really diversify our global footprint, to make sure that we can deal in the future more effectively with those potential restrictions has been something that was part of our capacity expansion strategy. Those are some of the a couple of examples of what I was referring to. And specifically for single-use assemblies, which I have mentioned before, our main production site was in Danvers, in Massachusetts, right? And deep in the pandemic, we were definitely challenged to ensure enough quantities for some of the other regions. And this is why we announced a major investment to expand in France, in Molsheim, and this new site in Europe will be operational by the end of 2021. And we will continue to do so with other regions.
Thank you. We're getting a lot of journalist questions in, so let's try and see if we can answer all of them. And if I can ask you to keep your answers relatively short. Albert, Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, question on innovation. Pfizer is developing a new version of the vaccine for the coronavirus that will target the Delta and the Alpha variant specifically. When will this vaccine be ready? And what else can you say about the status of this renewed vaccine now?
We are developing a specific version, but it is tailored to Delta. But my prediction is that we will not need it. I think that the data will demonstrate that the current one will be highly efficacious against Delta as well. The reason why we are doing also in parallel Delta is because we don't want to take any chances. You can't play with the human lives. Everything indicates that you will not need it, but just in case we are making one. Just to make sure that also people know that we have already done that with Beta. We have developed already a vaccine against the Beta virus, which actually we're submitting to the FDA. It's clearly that we will never use this vaccine. We will self it. We did that for the same reason. And also for every single variant that emerges, we are checking to see if the current vaccine works in case we are borderline or in case there are doubts because of, for example, in Delta, we're not borderline. In Delta, it was very clear that likely we cover it, but Delta was taking over the world like storm, so it was really very, very important. In cases that there are concerns, we will be building in parallel a new version of the vaccine that it is tailor-made to the new variant. The process, it is less than 100 days for us to do it right now. 95 days, we will go from end to end. So the idea is that we stay always ahead of the virus.
Understood. Paul, a question here from Novosti, a Russian outlet. Taking into account emerging new variants and lower efficacy of current vaccines, have you started to develop new vaccines that would be effective against Delta variant and others? And how long will this take Johnson & Johnson?
Well, we have tested extensively our current vaccine Delta, and we've measured patients' antibody levels, and it seems to be holding up very fine. So there is no need at the moment to be worried. We also measured the neutralizing antibodies, and that's also at a good level against Delta. And then the boosting testing, which is done, gives an anamnestic response within 7 days of a 9-fold boosting of the antibodies. So there are different solutions at the moment for an immediate impact if that would be needed. And like Albert is saying, the science is ongoing continuously. In case there is a new variant, then we'll get there. But at the moment, people should not worry that a new variant vaccine is needed now. It can be solved.
Bill, Politico, the European publication, is asking, what is the scale of monoclonal antibody production, and when might we see second-generation treatments?
Let's see. On the first question, what is the scale? Well, just to give you an idea, so the largest facility that we have, which I think is probably the largest in the world, has 200,000 liters of bioreactors. These are reactors where you grow mammalian cells, and those cells have been engineered, the genes have been spliced in so that they produce protein, like a monoclonal antibody. And so in the world, how many plants are there like that? There's maybe a dozen or 24, but not more than that. And so that's kind of what we're up against, is that, and by the way, you could say, well, what are all those other plants doing? They're making cancer medicines, they're making medicines for severe chronic diseases. So we can't just take them offline and stop making cancer medicines. And then you asked about next generation therapies. There are a number of things in development, but my guess is that the most potent and most promising will be oral. Will be pills, small molecules that kill the virus itself. That's really what you want to do when you're treating patients with Actemra. It's basically when they've already progressed, they've gotten very sick, they've had to be hospitalized. They're basically losing their ability to breathe, and so you really want to be able to treat people before they get so sick.
Paul, from West France, the newspaper, is vaccine hesitancy an issue, do you think, or do you consider that it's fading?
I think it continues to be an issue because with this Delta variant now, which is so more transmittable, I think more people are at risk because you have many people still not being vaccinated. And that is a problem in the US, but also in other countries. It will continue to mutate, it will continue to be transmitted, and it will re-emerge and kill other people. And therefore, vaccine hesitance continues to be a problem. And for whatever reason, people don't want to get vaccines. We have to work on making sure people very well understand that the risk of infection is much higher than any risk of a vaccine.
Belén, from the Health Industry Hub Australia, there is a significant focus on COVID-19 in terms of resources and funding, yet to put it in perspective, there are more deaths from the common flu, cancers and other chronic diseases per year. How should this be balanced better?
Well, if I have understood the question, I don't think you can look at this only on a 1 year basis. And when I spoke before, I believe we are yet not fully acquainted with what I call the collateral damage of COVID. So reconciling numbers will require that we further study what happened during COVID and what are the consequences of this. So I think it's premature to speculate or give numbers on this topic.
There's some questions now which are going to be very country specific to you. So let's start with Paul. This is from Live Mint India, who are asking, what is delaying your vaccine supply to India? And a follow-on questions, why are companies insisting on indemnity clauses from low and middle income countries for vaccine supply?
On point one on India, we started from scratch, from a completely new plant, completely new equipment. The plant was not there 18 months ago, and at this moment is being validated for drug substance as well as for fill and finish. There was no line. Today there is a fill and finish line, and that is what is put in place. And hopefully before the year end, we'll be able to start delivering vaccines to India on a large scale. The indemnity is to protect people, and it is making sure that governance.
I'm afraid we may have lost you, Paul. Paul, could you just repeat what you've just said, because we had a problem with the line on indemnity clauses. I think we're going to have to go back to Paul Stoffels from Johnson & Johnson. Paul, sorry, we had a line problem with you there. You broke up when you were talking about indemnity clauses, so could you repeat your point?
Yeah, so with regard to indemnity, we have made the companies have made an agreement with COVAX to cover that also for the low and middle income countries. So that is being worked on. Claire, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Sorry for the wrong connection.
These things happen in this virtual world. Albert, Health Policy Watch Geneva. The WHO has established a COVID-19 mRNA vaccine technology transfer hub in South Africa. But so far, mRNA producers have not joined it. Is this something Pfizer would consider joining? If not, why not?
What Pfizer is focusing on doing, it is to make sure that we manufacture as much as we can from this vaccine, and also that we keep up to the speed in creating the new technology that needs to be in case that the variants are appearing right now. Particularly in Africa, we did a local agreement with a local company, BioVac, which is a very high quality company, to produce locally in vaccines. I'm not sure what is the point of transferring a technology that it is going to take years to transfer. And by the way, this is what we do. I'm not sure I understand what they want to do. To give it someone else to do?
Thank you. I think you've made your point there. Another question, Albert. This is from UOL in Brazil. What was your offer to the Brazilian government in 2020, and why did the deal take so long to be achieved? Did the government make it difficult?
Look, I mean, it is not my role to reveal the discussions that we had with governments and if they were easy or difficult. What I know that right now we are giving a significant number of doses now to Brazil, and not only we are providing doses to Brazil, mainly coming from our manufacturing sites in the United States, but also we have just signed a similar deal like the one that we did with BioVac in Africa, we did with Pharma in Brazil, so that we will start local also manufacturing of the vaccine in Brazil, and those doses that will be produced in Brazil will be used for Latin America.
Thank you, Albert. And in fact, that picks up on a question that's come in from the Valor Econômico in Brazil, who are talking about that collaboration with Pharma. And they're just wondering how many doses are going to be annually produced in Brazil with Brazil's Pharma. Albert, are you hearing us?
I couldn't hear you. Can you repeat
the question?
Yes. I'm sorry.
It was about your deal with Pharma, and this was a question from Valor Econômico in Brazil, wanting to know the number of doses that were going to be produced with Pharma as a result of that collaboration.
Yeah, I expect that will exceed 100 million doses per year. That will be when we reach the peak capacity that will take, let's say, 1 year or so to reach. I'm not sure how long. We start it immediately, but once they are at full operational capacity, that will exceed 100 million per year doses.
Understood. Let me also ask a few other questions here. From Valor Econômico, Paul, what are your plans in terms of COVID-19 drugs or vaccine production for Brazil?
Well, at the moment, we have, as I said, 2 tech transfers, one to Aspen, one to BioE, and we deliver a vaccine from the US and Europe to Brazil. It's from a global supply network. The global supply network is working together across all of these different sites. And we decided early on in March last year which sites would be available to us, and Aspen and BioE were the only 2 sites with the right equipment and the right people. And since then, we have been working with our people to do the tech transfer. And as Bill was saying, tech transfer is very complicated, takes time, huge effort, and our own people were needed to supply, to do the tech transfers internally to the different sites from us. So that's why we couldn't handle more. 11 startups is more than enough in 12 months to be able to deal with. So.
Thank you, Paul. Very quick question, still on Brazil, for Belén and then Bill. They're just wanting to know what you're doing in terms of COVID-19 drugs and vaccine production in Brazil. Belén, first to you very quickly, and then Bill. And then we'll have 3 more questions before we conclude.
So as I mentioned before, we are supplying critical materials, on a global basis for all those projects that has been initiated in Brazil. So in terms of other activities that we have done around COVID, obviously we have from the very beginning of the pandemic, through our local organization, contributed with significant investment and donations of multiple basic therapies or hygiene products to be able to help the Brazilian patients. But the most important contribution is the contribution we made through supplying critical raw materials to vaccine manufacturers, to diagnostic products and COVID therapeutics.
Bill, Roche's plans for Brazil?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. As I mentioned, because our focus has been maximizing output, we've decided to go with a dedicated plant rather than splitting the production amongst many plants, and then we've supplemented that with external contracts. And so I don't believe any of those are in Brazil.
Also, I wanted to mention that what Bill just said, we have found that it is exactly what it works, right? And the only reason why I think we were able to have that big ramp up in manufacturing is because we focused on manufacturing sites that they have very big scale, very big capacity, and they are very well controlled in terms of scientific and technical expertise from the past. Now that we have reached a very certain level and we maximize, this is when now slowly, we are going to the outside and very selective. All the partners that we're selecting, Biopharma, for example, or Biovac, they are partners that they know how to do these things, and of course with our help, but also they are at a certain level. And I think this is the right way to go.
Let me add one thing, Claire.
Yes.
People don't understand that then hundreds of our people had to fly around during the middle of COVID around the world to do this. And even getting these people to the place to do all this work was a real challenge with the lack of flights, all the limits of people entering countries or leaving countries. And that has also contributed to the conclusion, like, let's do this as efficiently as possible. It was also a people and resource issue.
And I would just add to that, to what Paul just said, even a lot of these folks in the manufacturing plants, the engineers, their children were getting sent home from school to do school at home while they were needing to be at the plants for 14 hours a day. So it was very challenging. I think the manufacturing people at these companies are really unsung heroes in this pandemic. It's really remarkable, and it's been like that for a lot of our plants. They've all been running at full capacity since March of 2020. So
absolutely.
It's really, yeah.
A couple of last questions before we conclude. Albert, this is from Politico Europe. Given the clear economies of scale with the rapid increase in production, how do you justify the price increase for vaccine doses announced in August?
I didn't announce any price increases, and the prices remain within the tier pricing that we have set. So the cost of a meal in Europe or in the US or in Japan, it is the price that we're charging the vaccine.
Thomas, another question from Politico Europe. In the light of the Airfinity data, would pharmaceutical companies cooperate if an IP waiver was passed?
I think we've talked for quite a long time about this notion of IP waiver. What we have seen is companies are delivering. They are scaling up. What we have heard, whether it's from vaccines or from treatments, they are succeeding because they're so focused, so prioritized. And I think they are right to pick their partners. And the IP waiver would have been a distraction and probably more undermined the partnership expansion which we've seen than helped. And what we see is that IP is not holding us back from delivering on the vaccine capacity expansion. And we really see the turning the tide from having too few to enough to probably more than enough in the future. Therefore, I think IP is really not hindered.
Belén, from Le Figaro, what is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the pharma industry? How will it change the way you work, manufacture products and do R&D? It's a very big question, but if I could ask perhaps for you to be relatively concise, I'll also throw the question to Albert and then we'll conclude.
I will be very, very brief. I think COVID-19 has opened a completely different environment for the pharma and the life science industry. And as such, the standards for innovation have really raised. The speed at which we operate has been absolutely unprecedented. And today, of course, the ways of working, the ways of connecting with our people is completely different. The requirement for leadership will be absolutely different. So I think, we are giving mindful of the fact that the world overall will never be the same. We have to reimagine the way we operate to really excel in everything that is going to be critical to our growth, starting by people, strategies, but mostly innovation and dealing with the emerging hurdles that we have seen during COVID, and also the many opportunities that we have ahead of us.
Belén, thank you. Albert, how do you think it's going to change the way you work, manufacture products and do research and development?
I think what we have seen during COVID was basically two large-scale miracles happening. One was the development of treatments and vaccines in record time, and then the second was the scale-up of manufacturing to unprecedented capacities, again in record time. The question that remains, if we could do it with COVID, why not with cancer? Why not with cardiovascular diseases? Why not with other diseases that they are right now in the forefront of the disease heat map of the world? And that will require not only ourselves doing things differently, and we learn from this, but will require also regulators to do things differently. So the combination of the two, as it was a massive success during the COVID period, that could become equally big success in the fight against cancer, for example.
Thank you very, very much to all of our CEOs.
I wanted to add only...
Yes, please, Belén. Please.
I wanted to add one single point which has not been mentioned during the discussion, but has to do with this last question. And I didn't want to miss the opportunity to say that one of the most critical tools will be getting benefit from the digital and data acceleration that we have seen during COVID, right? So it has never been a better time for science and technology companies, right? And that is a very, very important trend that has really accelerated and emerged during COVID that I forgot to mention before.
Thank you very much, CEOs, for all of your remarks. I'm going to hand back to the Director General of IFPMA, Thomas Cueni, for your final thoughts before we conclude this press briefing.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thanks to our CEOs. What we have heard again, I think this is business not as usual, and we have heard from Albert, from Paul, Bill and Belén about the power of innovation and the power of science. That's, I think, what Albert said about cancer is something which will occupy the industry, but also the regulators and others. What can we replicate from the speed to development without compromising safety, which can be used and applied to other areas? I think the second element, which I believe is we are seeing light at the end of the tunnel, at least in the Western world and hopefully soon around the world. But at the same time, we have heard everybody is still focusing on continued innovation. I think very reassuring to us. Paul and Albert are very confident that their vaccine is still highly effective, that they will not need, the new variant, the new vaccines, but they're still investing in doing it, just in case. And I think lastly, and probably not least, and hopefully, I do believe that the data which we have showing the success of the scaling up, showing the excess doses available at the end of the year, I think if we really get the political leadership, the will to redistribute, allocate these doses towards the end of the year, but also next year, I think we can turn the tide and move to vaccine equity at a speed which is historic when you compare it to other historic pandemics.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, CEOs. Thank you, journalists, for your questions. And you'll find a recording of this media briefing on the IFPMA website very soon. So all I have to say to you now is stay well and stay safe. Thank you.